I wrote my thesis for my PhD in 1969 about the financial reform of Robert Peel. And the issue in 1842 Britain, they had navigation acts and they had corn laws and a system of protectionism, which essentially increased the cost of living of the working class to benefit essentially the rich landowners and the merchants and the smugglers as well, because protectionism brings about a lot of smuggling activity. And so Robert Peel, he went, and under the influence of a free trader who was influenced by Adam Smith at the time, he was Scottish, Richard Cobden, they reduced tariffs or eliminated most of them. They abolished the corn laws, they abolished the navigation acts, and brought England into a system of free trade, and the loss of income they had to endure because of these duties that were no longer levied was replaced by a permanent income tax at the rate of only 7% per annum, and it was levied only on a very few people in England, like 5,000 people, but no more. That then brought essentially prices down for agricultural commodities and benefited the working class. We had essentially after 1870 in the world a deflationary environment where prices went down, but real wages went up because wages didn't go down as much as the cost of living. And so the prosperity actually increased. And tariffs in general are actually very bad for an economy. And I just like to point out that there are many economists that will say what caused the Great Depression in America in the 1930s. They agree that obviously the Smoot-Hadley Acts were not favorable, which imposed heavy tariffs on imported goods. So I'd say the idea of Trump, maybe it's just a threat, but I'd like to point out 88% of the world's population lives in emerging economies, and a large portion of that is in BRICS countries. And the mood towards the Western arrogance and kind of neo-colonialism, where Western countries meddle into the domestic affairs of developing countries such as India and China and others, I think is more or less over. And these countries, when they are threatened by someone like Mr. Trump, in my view, they will actually react and oppose these tariffs and not bend over. So the resolution among emerging economies and BRICS countries will be actually the opposite of what the arrogant American State Department thinks. They think they can threaten the world, but the world has changed and it will not let itself be threatened by what they perceive in America, which is far from perfect. It will increase the cost of living of ordinary people. It will increase actually inflation. And don't think that foreign countries have no power. They have, because the US depends on some goods being manufactured in China, Vietnam, and so forth. Most of the expenditures of the US are mandatory. In other words, they have to be met. Like Social Security is very difficult to cut it. Veterans benefits, Medicare, and so forth. To cut that is next to impossible. And how are you going to get re-elected if you go and tell your pensioners your pensions will be cut by 30%? So the scope actually to reduce expenditures, in my opinion, if they can cut a few $100 billion, that would be the maximum I would think is possible. The second point is that he cannot do everything himself. I mean, there is Congress. And as you know, the Democrats are mostly against him, and some Republicans are also against him. So whether he can push all these measures through, I'm not sure. And the other observation I would like to make, I knew Larry Tisch relatively well, who was the head of and the founder of Lowe's Corporation. And his brother was Preston Tisch. In the 70s, Preston made the huge mistake that he wanted to do something for the community and clean up the American post office. After 1 year, he resigned. In the Greek saga Hercules, he has to clean up dirt in a stable. And these are the tasks that Musk will be faced with to clean up the government and the unions and so forth, I am very pessimistic about all these reforms. But let's say even Trump is successful at everything he does. The stock market has never been more pricey, more expensive in terms of valuations than it is now. And the global economy is not in a boom phase at all. Ordinary people around the world in general, they're faced with rising prices that are going up much more than what the bullshit office called BLS is publishing. This is a lie, what they're publishing about the CPI. Now, ordinary people are struggling everywhere. Otherwise, how would you explain that the number of people who can't live decently, in other words, they live paycheck to paycheck, has increased to the highest level ever in the US? How would you explain that housing affordability in the US is at the lowest in history of the US? If everything is so great, why is it? The housing starts and housing sales are poor because people don't have the money to buy them. Some of the policies that the Europeans have introduced, not only in Germany, but also in Spain and so forth, and France, are completely against any economic principle. We live in societies. We have to decide what do we want, how do we want to structure our society. Our society meaning the social conditions of the people. In my opinion, the top priority is to increase the standards of living of ordinary people, of everybody. The current setup, if I look at the money printing and so forth and the consequences of money printing, is that we have a society where more than 3/4 of society is being hurt by rising prices. Rising prices are commonly called inflation, but I'm careful in using the word inflation because inflation is misunderstood frequently. When prices go up for consumer goods like food and so forth, people talk about inflation. When prices of homes go up and prices of stocks and bonds, they talk about the bull market. You understand? But the origin is both the same, money printing. Look at any statistic in any country. The money printing has created a class of people that is super rich and masses that are relatively poor. I mean, I live in Thailand. I consider myself to be reasonably affluent, but I can tell you there are lots of people in this world, they have nothing at all, not a penny. And then what happened also over the last 20, 30 years in many countries, the rich, they don't need to borrow money. The only time they borrow money is to speculate because they are greedy. But poor people, if they want a car, if they want a motorcycle, even if they have an accident or so, they don't have the money to buy. They have to borrow. And then they are in the borrowing class, the class that has debts. And as interest rates went up, they're all squeezed. I've just written a report about this very high valuation in the US and low valuation elsewhere was in July of this year. I wrote about major turning point in asset markets because I think that we are in a period of great turmoil with some stocks reaching major lows from where a bull market will get underway, maybe not immediately, but let's say they're phasing out, and other stocks making major tops. And among these major tops would be the FANG stocks in America, the Magnificent Seven, semiconductor stocks, and so forth. And the basing stocks are more resource-oriented shares and emerging economies. The US has outperformed the rest of the world, and especially emerging economies, more than ever before. And the valuation differences are huge between the valuation of the US and valuations elsewhere. Say, one of the themes I have, and I have to give you some background, I've been known in Hong Kong as Dr. Doom because I was mostly negative about Hong Kong becoming part of China. Due to the high valuation of Hong Kong, I thought there would be an arbitrage that companies would resettle into China where land was cheap and leave Hong Kong, and that Hong Kong would become just another city sit in China. And so I have a clean sheet in being negative about property stocks in Hong Kong for a long time. But now, this year, I turned very positive about Hong Kong properties because real estate companies in Hong Kong are mostly controlled by families. The families are immensely rich and they don't need to take any risks, or they didn't borrow much money. Most of these Hong Kong property companies have actually no debts, and they could withstand a significant decline in property prices, which I still expect to happen. But on the other hand, the American media is always talking negatively about China, talking negatively about Hong Kong and so forth. But of all the cities I know in the world, Hong Kong would still be a place I would go because it's relatively free. It's like Thailand. I live in the north of Thailand, in Chiang Mai. And people talk about Thailand being a failed state. Now, this is interesting because this failed state is one of the most popular countries in the world for people to travel to and to live in. The retirees are flocking here because it's a failed state, yes, but you have a relatively high degree of freedom. So I find it sort of dictatorial to say Thailand is a failed state. Yes, it is in terms of economic growth rates. But on the other hand, in terms of lifestyle, it's not a failed state. Historically, platinum has traded at the premium to gold and at the discount to gold. Now, the discount is essentially the largest it's ever been. The market is much smaller than the gold market and is controlled largely by South Africa and Russia. South Africa and Russia are not the closest friends of America, as you can imagine. And if they are being hurt by Western colonialist, neo-colonialist nations, I think they could easily squeeze the market. And that's why I always maintain coffee and cocoa are markets that can go ballistic because they're relatively narrow markets. So when the bull market starts in cocoa, it usually goes and becomes way overvalued. Same for coffee. Last year was the year for cocoa, this year for coffee, next year who knows. Given the fact that inflation adjusted platinum is now extremely low as it was in 1970, whereas gold and silver are relatively high. The gold market actually, given that it's been so strong, attracts little speculation. This is something that surprises me. Is also the gold market is up for the first time. Gold mining shares have not participated. They're underperforming. And many fund managers are telling me, Mark, for the last 50 years, whenever the gold market went up, gold miners went up more percentage-wise, but not this time. And I keep on telling them, this is the beauty of investment markets. They're never the same. It changes.